The world's most forbidden places exist not merely as physical locations, but as mirrors reflecting the deepest fractures in human understanding, each one a locked door behind which lies something we cannot bear to know, yet cannot stop ourselves from seeking. You are about to descend into 20 territories where exclusion itself becomes a form of revelation, where the act of keeping you out speaks louder than any truth they might contain. Section 1. North Sentinel Island. You stand at the edge of North Sentinel Island, where the very concept of contact dissolves into something far more primitive and terrifying than mere isolation. This is not simply an island cut off from the modern world. This is a place where time itself has been weaponized, where 60,000 years of separation have created something that challenges your most fundamental assumptions about human nature and progress. The Sentinelese kill on sight. Not from hatred, not from fear, as you understand it, but from something deeper, a biological imperative that recognizes your very existence as a contamination. When you look across those waters, you are not seeing a lost tribe clinging to ancient ways. You are witnessing the purest expression of what humans become when they reject every assumption you hold about civilization, progress, and the inevitability of connection. Consider the mathematics of their isolation. While you accumulated 60,000 years of technological advancement, social complexity, and supposed enlightenment, they perfected something else entirely, the art of remaining unchanged. Their consistency is not stagnation. It is a form of temporal resistance that makes your entire concept of progress appear arbitrary, even absurd. They have achieved what your civilization considers impossible. They have stopped time. The Indian government maintains a 3-mile exclusion zone around the island, not to protect you from them, but to protect them from you. This legal barrier acknowledges something your rationality struggles to accept, that contact itself is a form of violence, that your very presence constitutes an act of destruction. The law recognizes what your conscience cannot, that sometimes the greatest respect you can show another human being is to admit that you are toxic to their existence. What terrifies you most about North Sentinel Island is not that they kill outsiders. It is that they have proven outsiders are unnecessary, that human society can exist in perfect isolation, and that your interconnected world might be nothing more than a complex form of mutual dependence that they have transcended entirely. Section 2. Room 39, North Korea. Room 39 exists in a space where economics becomes indistinguishable from necromancy, where the very concept of money transforms into something that violates every assumption you hold about how value, power, and reality intersect. This is not merely a government office hidden in Pyongyang. This is a location where the normal rules of existence have been suspended, where billions of dollars flow through channels that exist outside the recognized architecture of global finance. The room's official designation tells you nothing about its true nature. Bureau 39, Office 39, Division 39. The number itself becomes a form of camouflage, a way of hiding the incomprehensible within the mundane. But behind this bureaucratic facade lies something that challenges your understanding of how modern states operate, how money moves through the world, and how power maintains itself when cut off from legitimate economic systems. You cannot comprehend. Room 39. Without first accepting that North Korea has achieved something your economists insist is impossible. They have created a parallel economy that operates entirely outside the global financial system, while somehow generating billions in revenue. This is not mere sanction dodging or black market trading. This is the systematic construction of an alternative reality where different rules of economics apply, where money can be created, moved, and utilized through methods that exist outside your understanding of how wealth functions. The counterfeit supernotes produced under Room 39's coordination are not inferior copies. They are superior to the originals in every measurable way. The paper is more durable, the ink more precise, the security features more sophisticated than those produced by the U.S. Bureau of Engraving and Printing. This creates a philosophical paradox that threatens the very foundation of monetary systems. If the fake money is better than the real money, what exactly makes the real money real? What keeps you awake at night about Room 39 is not the fear that they are stealing from your economy. It is the realization that they have revealed your economy to be nothing more than a collective agreement that can be violated by anyone with sufficient technical skill and complete disregard for the social contracts you consider inviolable. Section 3. Area 51. Area 51 exists as a wound in the landscape of knowability, a place where the government's relationship with truth becomes so convoluted that denial itself transforms into a form of revelation. For decades, officials insisted this location did not exist, creating a logical paradox that still haunts the architecture of official reality. How can something that doesn't exist be classified? The base sprawls across the Nevada desert like a question mark burned into the earth, surrounded by warning signs that threaten lethal force against trespassers. But these warnings protect something far more dangerous than experimental aircraft or recovered alien technology. They protect the principle that some forms of knowledge are too dangerous for human consciousness to process. Area 51 is not hiding objects. It is hiding the concept that there are things you are not allowed to know, and that this prohibition might be for your own protection. You cannot understand Area 51 without first accepting that the U.S. government has achieved something that should be impossible in a democratic society. They have created a space where accountability simply does not apply, where the normal mechanisms of oversight and transparency have been suspended indefinitely. This is not merely classification or national security. This is the systematic construction of an unknowable zone within knowable reality. The psychological experiments conducted at Area 51 go far beyond testing experimental aircraft. They test the limits of human curiosity, the boundaries of what citizens will accept as necessary secrecy, and the precise point at which democratic oversight transforms into complicit ignorance. Every person who knows about Area 51 but accepts its existence is participating in an experiment about the malleability of their own principles. Consider the geometry of the no-fly zone that surrounds the base. Military aircraft will shoot down any plane that enters this airspace, creating a three-dimensional volume of space where the normal rules of aviation law, international airspace, and even basic property rights simply do not apply. This is not just restricted airspace. This is a hole in the legal fabric of reality, a place where the Constitution stops working and something else takes over. The camouflaged personnel who guard Area 51's perimeter are not soldiers in any conventional sense. They are guardians of a boundary between what you are allowed to know and what you are not, between the reality you inhabit and the reality that exists beyond your clearance level. When they aim their weapons at trespassers, they are not protecting national security. They are protecting the principle that some forms of knowledge are toxic to human consciousness. What happens inside Area 51 is less important than what happens to you when you think about Area 51. The base functions as a psychological weapon designed to test your tolerance for uncertainty, your willingness to accept that some questions cannot be answered, and your ability to live with the knowledge that your government maintains facilities that exist outside your understanding of legitimate governmental authority. But here lies the deeper horror. Area 51 may not be hiding anything at all. The most classified aspect of the base might be that it serves primarily as a testing ground for how much secrecy a democratic society will tolerate before it stops being democratic. The real experiment might be you, and your willingness to accept that some places are simply off limits to human knowledge. Why does Area 51 continue to exist in an age of satellite surveillance and digital transparency? Unless the point is not to hide specific objects, but to maintain the concept that hiding is possible, that there are still territories in your world where the unknown can be preserved and weaponized against your own curiosity. Section 4. Vatican Secret Archives. The Vatican Secret Archives stretch beneath the Holy See, like a nervous system of forbidden knowledge. 53 miles of shelving, containing documents that could rewrite everything you think you know about the relationship between spiritual authority and historical truth. But these are not simply old papers locked away for scholarly protection. These are the accumulated secrets of an institution that has spent 2 millennia learning how to transform knowledge into power by controlling who gets to know what and when. The very name reveals the psychological weapon at work here. Secret archives, not private, not restricted, not confidential, but secret, a word that immediately transforms every document within into something that challenges your right to know. The Vatican has achieved something that should be impossible in the modern world. They have created a space where intellectual curiosity becomes a form of trespass, where the desire to know is treated as a spiritual failing. You cannot understand the Vatican Secret Archives without first accepting that the Catholic Church has spent centuries perfecting the art of strategic revelation. They do not simply hide information, they reveal information in carefully controlled doses, turning the gradual release of historical documents into a form of theological control. Every document they choose to make public is simultaneously a revelation and a concealment, showing you one truth while drawing your attention away from dozens of others. The selection process for scholars allowed to access the archives operates according to principles that violate every assumption you hold about academic freedom and intellectual inquiry. The Church decides not only who can see which documents, but how long they can look at them, what they can publish about them, and even what questions they are allowed to ask. This is not scholarship. This is the systematic construction of a reality where the Church maintains permanent editorial control over its own history. Consider the psychological implications of documents that are classified for centuries. When the Vatican restricts access to papers for 100 years, they are not simply protecting contemporary individuals from embarrassment. They are engaging in a form of temporal manipulation that treats future generations as fundamentally different species with different rights to know. They have created a legal framework where your great-grandchildren will know things about your world that you are not allowed to know about your own time. The archives contain correspondence between popes and world leaders, records of Inquisition proceedings, documents related to the Church's position on slavery, its response to the Holocaust, and its negotiations with fascist regimes. But the most dangerous documents are not the ones that reveal the Church's failures. They are the ones that reveal how successfully the Church has managed to maintain institutional continuity. Despite those failures, how it has developed systems for absorbing scandals without fundamental change. The real horror of the Vatican Secret Archives is not what they contain, but what they represent. The principle that some institutions are allowed to be their own historians, that they can maintain permanent control over how their actions are understood and evaluated. The Church has achieved something that should be impossible in a world of historical scholarship. They have made themselves the sole authorized interpreters of their own behavior across centuries. But here lies the deeper psychological weapon. The archives create a form of intellectual dependency where even the most critical scholars must ultimately rely on the Church's goodwill to access the documents needed to evaluate the Church's actions. The Vatican has created a system where their critics must become their guests, where the very act of researching Church history requires participating in Church-controlled procedures. The documents released from the archives are not simply historical records. They are carefully curated performances designed to shape how you understand the relationship between religious authority and historical truth. Every release is both a confession and a misdirection, showing you one aspect of institutional behavior while directing your attention away from the systems that make such behavior possible. What keeps you awake at night about the Vatican's secret archives is not the fear of what specific documents they might contain. It is the realization that they represent a successful experiment in institutional immortality, a demonstration that some organizations can maintain permanent control over their own accountability by turning historical transparency into a privilege they grant rather than a right you possess. Section 5. Snake Island. Snake Island exists as a mathematical proof that nature can achieve something your civilization has never managed: perfect population control through the systematic elimination of invasive species. Ilha da Queimada Grande sits off the coast of Brazil like a biological weapon aimed at the very concept of human expansion, home to between 2,000 and 4,000 golden lancehead vipers, whose venom can kill you in minutes, and whose presence has made the island completely uninhabitable to human life. The Brazilian government maintains a complete ban on civilian access to the island, not to protect you from the snakes, but to protect the snakes from you. This legal framework acknowledges something your consciousness struggles to accept: that there are ecosystems so perfectly balanced that human presence would constitute an act of ecological terrorism. The island exists as proof that nature can create spaces where your species is simply not welcome, where your presence would disrupt biological systems that have achieved something you never will: sustainability through perfect predation. You cannot comprehend Snake Island without first accepting that the golden lancehead vipers represent an evolutionary solution to the problem of human expansion. These snakes have developed venom that is 5 times more potent than their mainland relatives, creating a biological barrier that functions more effectively than any human-designed security system. They have achieved what your military strategists dream of: absolute territorial control through the credible threat of immediate death. The island's ecosystem operates according to principles that violate your assumptions about natural balance. The snakes survive entirely on birds, creating a predator-prey relationship so efficient that it has eliminated the need for any other large vertebrates. This is not merely a successful ecosystem. It is a demonstration that nature can create closed systems that function perfectly without human intervention or oversight. Consider the psychological implications of an island where human technology becomes meaningless. Your weapons, your protective equipment, your medical knowledge, none of it matters when confronted with an environment that has evolved specifically to kill large vertebrates quickly and efficiently. The island exists as a reminder that all your technological advancement is ultimately vulnerable to biological systems that operate according to different principles than the ones you understand. The golden lancehead vipers are not simply dangerous animals. They are living proof that evolution can create solutions to problems you didn't know existed. Their venom works so quickly that victims often die before they can call for help, creating a biological security system that functions through the elimination of witnesses. The island maintains its secrecy not through human enforcement, but through the simple fact that trespassers do not survive to report what they have seen. But here lies the deeper horror. Snake Island represents a successful experiment in biological isolationism that makes your political borders appear arbitrary and ineffective. The snakes have achieved what your immigration policies, your military bases, and your legal systems cannot. They have created a territory that is genuinely impermeable to human intrusion. The island's ecosystem functions as a closed loop where death and life maintain perfect balance without external intervention. The snakes eat the birds eat the insects decompose the snake droppings, and the cycle continues without requiring any input from or accommodation to human understanding. This is not simply a functioning ecosystem, it is a demonstration that natural systems can achieve sustainability through principles that are completely alien to human economic and social organization. The few scientists who have been permitted to study the island under strict government supervision describe an environment that challenges fundamental assumptions about the relationship between predator and prey, between individual survival and ecosystem health. The golden lanceheads have achieved something that should be impossible. They have created a predator-dominated ecosystem that remains stable across generations. The island exists as a standing challenge to the assumption that human expansion is inevitable, that every environment can be made safe for human habitation through sufficient technology and determination. Snake Island proves that nature can create spaces that are genuinely uninhabitable, where human presence is not just unwelcome, but biologically impossible. What terrifies you most about Snake Island is not the fear of being bitten by venomous snakes. It is the realization that the island represents a successful model of territorial control through the systematic elimination of threats, and that this model works better than any human-designed security system. Section 6. Svalbard Global Seed Vault. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault sits buried in Arctic ice like a confession of humanity's ultimate failure, a technological monument to the assumption that your species will eventually destroy the biological diversity that makes life on Earth possible. This is not simply a storage facility for plant genetic material. This is an architectural admission that you cannot be trusted with the responsibility of maintaining the ecosystems that sustain your existence. The vault represents the systematic preparation for your own ecological collapse, a $9 million investment in the assumption that future generations will inherit a world where the basic plants needed for human survival no longer exist in nature. When scientists deposit seeds in the vault, they are not preserving genetic diversity. They are creating evidence for a future trial where the question will be whether your generation committed crimes against the biological future of the planet. You cannot understand the Svalbard Seed Vault without first accepting that it exists as a hedge against your own destructive potential. The vault is not designed to protect seeds from natural disasters or climate change. It is designed to protect seeds from you, from the systematic destruction of agricultural diversity that your industrial farming methods have made inevitable. The psychological implications of the vault's location reveal the depth of desperation behind its construction. Svalbard was chosen not because it is safe from climate change, but because it is far enough from human civilization that it might survive the collapse of the social and economic systems that make seed preservation necessary. The vault exists in a space that is geographically human, but psychologically post-human, designed to function after the failure of the civilizations that created it. Consider the selection process that determines which seeds get stored in the vault. Scientists and governments must decide which plants are worth preserving for the future, which varieties of crops are essential for human survival, and which genetic lines are valuable enough to merit permanent protection. This is not simply scientific classification. This is the systematic construction of a biological hierarchy where some forms of life are deemed more worthy of survival than others. The vault contains over 1 million seed samples from nearly every country on Earth, representing the genetic diversity that has been systematically eliminated by industrial agriculture over the past century. Each sample is simultaneously a preservation and an admission of guilt, evidence of biodiversity that once existed naturally, but now requires technological intervention to survive. The facility operates according to principles that violate your assumptions about ownership and control. The seeds belong to the countries that deposited them, but the vault is maintained by an international trust that operates outside normal governmental authority. This creates a legal framework where the genetic future of human food security is controlled by institutions that exist outside democratic accountability. But here lies the deeper horror. The vault represents a successful experiment in biological colonialism, where wealthy nations and international organizations control the genetic resources that determine the agricultural future of the entire planet. The seeds stored in Svalbard are not simply preserved plant material. They are the building blocks of a future where food security depends on access to genetic resources controlled by institutions that exist outside national sovereignty. The vault's design reveals the psychological assumptions behind its construction. The facility is built to last for thousands of years, designed to function even if the electrical systems fail. The governments that built it collapse, and the scientific institutions that maintain it disappear. This is not simply long-term planning. This is the systematic preparation for the failure of human civilization. The seeds stored in the vault are not simply genetic material. They are accusations against your generation's stewardship of the planet. Evidence that you have created a world where the basic plants needed for human survival cannot survive naturally. Each seed represents a species that has been so thoroughly eliminated from its natural environment that it requires technological intervention to continue existing. The vault exists as a monument to the assumption that future generations will be more responsible than your generation, that they will somehow develop the wisdom to use these genetic resources sustainably, despite inheriting a world where such wisdom was systematically eliminated by the economic and political systems that created the need for the vault in the first place. What keeps you awake at night about the Svalbard Global Seed Vault is not the fear that it might fail to preserve genetic diversity. It is the realization that its very existence proves that your generation has already failed, that you have created a world where the biological future of the planet depends on the functionality of a single facility buried in Arctic ice. Section 7. Bohemian Grove. Bohemian Grove exists as a temporal anomaly where the most powerful men in the world gather annually to perform rituals that would be considered psychotic if conducted by anyone else, transforming a redwood forest in California into a space where the normal rules of sanity, democracy, and adult behavior are suspended for 2 weeks every summer. This is not simply an elite retreat. This is a location where power reveals its true relationship to theatrical insanity. The Grove operates according to principles that violate every assumption you hold about how modern leadership functions. Presidents, Supreme Court justices, corporate executives, and military leaders gather to perform amateur theatrical productions, engage in mock human sacrifice, and participate in ceremonies that seem designed to demonstrate their complete disconnection from the reality that their decisions shape for the rest of humanity. You cannot understand Bohemian Grove without first accepting that the most powerful people in your society maintain their psychological equilibrium through ritualized regression to pre-rational behavior. The annual cremation of care ceremony, where a mock human sacrifice is performed in front of a 40-foot stone owl, is not simply eccentric theater. It is a demonstration that your leaders maintain their ability to make decisions about human life and death by periodically engaging in symbolic celebrations of their own detachment from human empathy. The Grove's membership represents a cross-section of American power, so complete that their annual gathering constitutes an informal shadow government that operates outside any constitutional framework. When the President of the United States, the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, and the CEOs of major corporations gather in the same location for 2 weeks without any democratic oversight, they are not simply networking. They are creating a space where the most important decisions affecting your life can be made outside the institutions designed to provide accountability. Consider the psychological implications of grown men who control nuclear weapons and global economic systems, choosing to spend their leisure time performing amateur theatrical productions about woodland spirits and ancient mysteries. The Grove's activities reveal something disturbing about the relationship between power and psychological development. The most powerful people in your society have not transcended childish behavior, but have instead created institutional frameworks that allow them to indulge in it without consequences. The Grove's security measures create a space where the normal rules of journalistic access, governmental transparency, and democratic oversight simply do not apply. The location is surrounded by private security forces that function more like a foreign military than domestic law enforcement, creating a temporary autonomous zone where constitutional rights are suspended and accountability is eliminated. But here lies the deeper horror. Bohemian Grove represents a successful experiment in the systematic separation of power from responsibility. The Grove creates a space where the most powerful people in your society can form personal relationships, make informal agreements, and develop shared understanding outside any democratic framework. The decisions that shape your life are being influenced by conversations that happen around campfires during amateur theatrical productions. The Grove's rituals serve a function that is more disturbing than simple networking or relaxation. They create shared experiences of transgression that bind the participants together through mutual complicity in activities that would be considered evidence of mental illness if performed by anyone outside the power elite. The ceremonies function as a form of psychological hazing that ensures institutional loyalty through shared participation in ritualized abnormality. The annual gathering represents something that should be impossible in a democratic society, a space where the most powerful people in the country can meet regularly without any oversight, accountability, or transparency. The Grove has achieved what should be impossible. They have created an institution that operates outside democratic control while maintaining significant influence over democratic institutions. The Grove's exclusivity is not simply about membership fees or social status. It is about the systematic creation of a space where power can be exercised without the constraints that democratic societies place on power. The location functions as a laboratory for exploring what happens when the most powerful people in society are freed from the normal constraints of professional responsibility and public accountability. What terrifies you most about Bohemian Grove is not the specific activities that take place there. It is the realization that your society has created an institution where the most powerful people in the world can gather annually to demonstrate their complete disconnection from the reality that their decisions create for everyone else. Section 8. Mezhgorye. Mezhgorye exists as a city that has achieved something that should be impossible in the modern world. It has made itself disappear from reality while remaining functionally present in the physical world. This is not simply a classified military installation hidden in the Ural Mountains. This is a location that has been systematically erased from official existence while maintaining a population of several thousand people who technically do not exist. The city does not appear on Russian maps, is not included in census data, and maintains no official postal service, yet it continues to function as a municipal entity with residential neighborhoods, schools, and commercial services. Mezhgorye represents a successful experiment in the systematic construction of parallel reality, where thousands of people live and work in a space that has been officially classified out of existence. You cannot understand Mezhgorye without first accepting that the Russian government has achieved something that violates the basic principles of modern cartography and census taking. They have created a populated area that exists outside the official recognition of its own existence. The city functions according to principles that should be impossible in a world of satellite surveillance and digital mapping, where every square meter of Earth's surface has been photographed and cataloged. The city's primary function appears to be guarding Mount Yamantau, a massive underground complex that may contain the largest nuclear bunker ever constructed. But the true purpose of Mezhgorye is not simply to protect a military installation. It is to demonstrate that the Russian government can maintain entire populations in a state of official non-existence while providing them with the infrastructure necessary for normal civilian life. Consider the psychological implications of living in a city that does not officially exist. The residents of Mezhgorye must maintain their daily lives while participating in a collective fiction that their community is not real, that their children attend schools that are not on any official record, and that their work contributes to projects that cannot be acknowledged by the government that funds them. The city's administrative structure operates according to principles that violate every assumption you hold about how modern governments function. Mezhgorye has municipal services, law enforcement, and healthcare systems that are funded by budgets that do not officially exist and administered by officials who hold no formal governmental positions. This is not simply classified government work. This is the systematic construction of a shadow bureaucracy that operates outside the official structure of the Russian state. The city's residents live in a space that exists between reality and non-reality, where their daily existence is real, but their official existence is denied. They participate in a community that functions according to normal social and economic principles, while being systematically excluded from the official recognition that makes citizenship meaningful. But here lies the deeper horror. Mezhgorye represents a successful experiment in the systematic construction of expendable populations. The city's residents exist in a legal framework where their rights, their safety, and their very existence depend entirely on the continued goodwill of institutions that refuse to acknowledge their existence. They have been transformed into a population that can be eliminated without official consequences because they were never officially present. The city serves as a testing ground for techniques of population control that operate through the manipulation of official reality rather than physical coercion. The residents of Medjugorje are not prisoners. They are participants in a system that has made their existence conditional on their willingness to remain officially invisible. The city's isolation from normal governmental oversight creates a space where the usual constraints on governmental power do not apply. The officials who control Medjugorje operate outside the normal chain of command, outside the usual budget processes, and outside the legal frameworks that provide accountability for governmental actions. Medjugorje exists as proof that modern governments can maintain populations in states of official non-existence while providing them with the material conditions necessary for normal social life. The city demonstrates that the distinction between reality and official reality can be manipulated to create spaces where different rules apply to different populations. The city's success in maintaining its non-existence while functioning as a normal municipal entity represents something that should be impossible in the modern world. A demonstration that entire populations can be made invisible through administrative rather than physical means, that the power to control official reality is more absolute than the power to control physical reality. What keeps you awake at night about Medjugorje is not the fear of what military secrets it might be protecting. It is the realization that it represents a successful experiment in the systematic construction of populations that exist outside official recognition, proving that governments can maintain absolute control over entire communities by simply denying that they exist. Section 9. Poveglia Island. Poveglia Island exists as a concentrated repository of human suffering, so dense that the soil itself has become a form of archaeological evidence for the systematic failure of human compassion. This small island in the Venetian lagoon has been transformed by centuries of use as a plague quarantine station and later as a mental hospital into a location where the boundary between physical space and psychological trauma has dissolved entirely. The island's soil contains the cremated remains of over 160,000 plague victims, creating a landscape that is literally composed of human ash mixed with earth. When you walk on Poveglia, you are not simply visiting a historical site. You are walking on the physical remains of people who were systematically abandoned by their society to die in isolation. The island exists as a monument to the principle that some forms of human suffering are so threatening to social order that they must be physically removed from the presence of healthy populations. You cannot understand Poveglia without first accepting that Venice used the island as a solution to the problem of what to do with people who were considered too dangerous to live, but too numerous to execute. The plague quarantine was not designed to cure the sick. It was designed to contain contamination by allowing the infected to die without threatening the healthy population. The island served as a form of medical concentration camp, where the elimination of the sick was disguised as healthcare. The island's history reveals the psychological mechanisms that allow societies to systematically abandon their most vulnerable members while maintaining the fiction that they are providing care. The quarantine station was not a medical facility. It was a dying facility, a place where people were sent not to recover, but to die, without contaminating the social body that had expelled them. Consider the psychological implications of a landscape where human remains have been so thoroughly integrated into the physical environment that they cannot be separated from the natural ecosystem. The island's vegetation grows in soil that is partly human ash, creating a biological system where the boundary between human and natural has been eliminated through the systematic processing of human bodies into environmental components. The island's later use as a mental hospital represents the evolution of its function from a place where the physically sick were sent to die to a place where the mentally sick were sent to disappear. The psychiatric facility continued the island's primary function, the systematic removal of problematic populations from social visibility, while adapting to new categories of human problems that required elimination. The mental hospital's chief physician, Dr. Adolfo Bonifacio, conducted experimental lobotomies and surgical procedures on patients who had no legal protection and no social advocates. The island provided a space where medical experimentation could be conducted on human subjects who had been classified as having no social value, where the normal constraints of medical ethics did not apply because the patients were considered already dead to society. But here lies the deeper horror. Poveglia represents a successful experiment in the systematic construction of spaces where human beings can be processed as waste products rather than treated as moral subjects. The island perfected techniques for eliminating problematic populations while maintaining the fiction that they were being cared for rather than destroyed. The island's current status as privately owned but completely uninhabitable creates a legal framework where the site of systematic human elimination has been transformed into a commodity that cannot be used for any normal purpose. The island exists as a form of toxic real estate where the accumulated trauma of centuries of human suffering has made normal human habitation impossible. The island's abandonment represents the final stage in its evolution as a space for processing human waste. It has become so contaminated with human suffering that it can no longer serve any function in normal society. The island exists as a monument to the principle that some forms of human treatment create spaces that are permanently uninhabitable. Poveglia's soil analysis reveals not just human remains, but also the metal fragments from cremation procedures, creating a landscape that is literally composed of the industrial processing of human bodies. The island exists as an archaeological site where the evidence of systematic human elimination has been preserved in the physical environment. The island's current legal status as private property that cannot be developed creates a situation where the site of systematic human rights violations has been transformed into a commodity that has no use value. The island exists as a form of toxic investment where the accumulated trauma of its history has made any normal economic use impossible. What terrifies you most about Poveglia Island is not the fear of encountering ghosts or supernatural phenomena. It is the realization that the island represents a successful model for the systematic elimination of unwanted populations disguised as healthcare, and that this model continues to operate in modified forms throughout the modern world. Section 10. Lascaux Cave. Lascaux Cave exists as a space where human consciousness first learned to transcend the boundaries of individual mortality through the creation of permanent visual records, but it has become a location where the very act of human observation destroys the evidence of humanity's greatest artistic achievement. The cave contains 17,000-year-old paintings that represent the earliest known examples of sophisticated human artistic expression, but these images are so fragile that your presence, your breath, your body heat, your very existence causes them to deteriorate. The cave represents a cruel paradox that defines the relationship between human consciousness and cultural preservation. The art that most perfectly captures the essence of human creative potential can only be preserved by prohibiting humans from experiencing it. The paintings that prove humanity's capacity for transcendent artistic expression are destroyed by the very human consciousness they were created to communicate with. You cannot understand Lascaux without first accepting that the cave functions as a monument to the self-defeating nature of human cultural achievement. The paintings were created to be seen, to communicate across time, to preserve human experience for future generations. But they can only continue to exist if future generations are prohibited from seeing them, if the communication they were designed to facilitate is permanently interrupted. The cave's closure to public access represents something more disturbing than simple conservation. It represents the systematic construction of a cultural treasure that exists primarily as an absence, a masterpiece that can only be preserved by being made inaccessible to the culture that created it. The paintings exist as evidence of human artistic achievement that humans are not allowed to witness. Consider the psychological implications of art that is destroyed by observation. The Lascaux paintings challenge the fundamental assumption that cultural artifacts exist to be experienced by human consciousness. These images reveal that the most important human cultural achievements may be incompatible with human presence, that the act of cultural preservation requires the systematic exclusion of the culture being preserved. The cave's microclimate is so delicate that the carbon dioxide from human breath, the moisture from human skin, and the heat from human bodies create chemical reactions that cause the pigments to fade and the cave walls to deteriorate. The paintings are not simply old. They are actively allergic to human presence, designed by time and chemistry to exist only in the absence of the consciousness that created them. The replica cave constructed for tourists represents something more disturbing than simple accommodation. It represents the systematic replacement of authentic cultural experience with manufactured simulation. Visitors to Lascaux, too, are not experiencing the cave paintings. They are experiencing a carefully constructed fiction designed to provide the psychological satisfaction of cultural contact without the cultural content that makes such contact meaningful. But here lies the deeper horror. Lascaux represents a successful experiment in the systematic construction of cultural value through exclusion. The cave's inaccessibility hasn't diminished its cultural importance, it has enhanced it, transforming the paintings from accessible art into sacred relics, whose value depends entirely on their unavailability to normal human experience. The cave's preservation requires the systematic monitoring of atmospheric conditions, humidity levels, and bacterial growth, creating a technological infrastructure that is more complex and expensive than the social infrastructure required to maintain most living cultural institutions. The cave exists as a cultural artifact that requires more resources to preserve than it provides in cultural value. The paintings themselves depict animals that were hunted to extinction by the same human populations that created the artistic representations. The cave exists as a monument to the systematic destruction of the natural world by the same consciousness that was sophisticated enough to create permanent artistic records of that destruction. What keeps you awake at night about Lascaux Cave is not the fear that the paintings might be permanently damaged. It is the realization that the cave represents a successful experiment in the systematic transformation of human cultural achievement into something that can only exist through the exclusion of human experience, proving that the most meaningful expressions of human consciousness may be fundamentally incompatible with human presence. Section 11. Chernobyl Exclusion Zone. The Chernobyl exclusion zone exists as a 30-kilometer radius of technological failure, so complete that it has accidentally created the most successful wildlife preserve in Europe, a space where the systematic elimination of human presence has allowed non-human life to flourish in ways that reveal the true environmental cost of human civilization. This is not simply a contaminated area. This is a location where human technological hubris has created an involuntary experiment in what Earth looks like when human management is suddenly removed. The zone represents something that should be impossible, according to your assumptions about radiation and biological life. It has become a thriving ecosystem where animals live longer, reproduce more successfully, and achieve higher population densities than in areas managed by human conservation efforts. The radiation that was supposed to make the area uninhabitable has instead created conditions where non-human life can exist without the systematic interference that characterizes human environmental management. You cannot understand Chernobyl without first accepting that the disaster has revealed something disturbing about the relationship between human presence and environmental health. The zone's accidental rewilding demonstrates that the most effective form of environmental protection may be the complete elimination of human presence, that your species' attempts at environmental stewardship are less successful than your complete absence. The abandoned city of Pripyat serves as a museum of human hubris where every building, every street, every carefully planned public space has been transformed into evidence of the systematic failure of technological optimism. The city was designed to represent the pinnacle of Soviet urban planning, a space where nuclear technology would create a perfect synthesis of human community and technological progress. Instead, it has become a monument to the principle that human technological systems inevitably fail in ways that make human habitation impossible. Consider the psychological implications of a space where human absence has created conditions more conducive to life than human presence. The zone's wildlife populations have not simply recovered from the disaster. They have achieved population levels that exceed anything recorded in the area's pre-nuclear history. The elimination of human hunting, farming, and development has created an environment where non-human life can flourish, despite radiation levels that would be considered lethal to human civilization. The zone's current status as an inadvertent nature preserve reveals something disturbing about the relationship between human environmental management and actual environmental health. The area's ecosystems function more successfully without human intervention than they ever did under human stewardship, suggesting that your species' understanding of environmental management is fundamentally flawed. The few humans who remain in the zone, mostly elderly residents who refused evacuation, have achieved something that should be impossible according to official radiation safety standards. They have continued to live, work, and maintain social relationships in an environment that has been classified as uninhabitable, demonstrating that the relationship between radiation exposure and human health is more complex than the models used to justify the evacuation. But here lies the deeper horror. Chernobyl represents a successful experiment in the systematic elimination of human presence that has created conditions more conducive to biological flourishing than human civilization. The zone demonstrates that the most effective form of environmental restoration may be the complete removal of human management, that your species' attempts to improve natural systems are less successful than your complete absence. The zone's tourism industry represents something more disturbing than simple disaster voyeurism. It represents the systematic commodification of human failure, where the evidence of technological catastrophe has been transformed into a consumer experience that generates revenue for the same governmental systems that created the disaster. The zone's legal status as permanently uninhabitable creates a framework where the site of human technological failure has been transformed into a space that exists outside normal property law, citizenship rights, and governmental responsibility. The area functions as a legal void where the normal rules of human habitation, property ownership, and civic participation have been suspended indefinitely. What terrifies you most about the Chernobyl exclusion zone is not the fear of radiation exposure. It is the realization that the zone represents a successful model for environmental restoration through the systematic elimination of human presence, proving that the most effective form of environmental protection may be the complete removal of human civilization. Section 12. Pine Gap. Pine Gap exists as a joint U.S.-Australian intelligence facility in the middle of the Australian desert, where the very concept of national sovereignty dissolves into something far more complex and disturbing than simple international cooperation. This is not merely a foreign military base on Australian soil. This is a location where the normal rules of democratic governance, territorial authority, and constitutional law have been suspended to accommodate forms of surveillance and intelligence gathering that exist outside the legal frameworks of both nations. The facility operates according to agreements that have never been fully disclosed to the democratic institutions of either country, creating a space where the most intrusive surveillance systems ever developed are deployed without the oversight mechanisms that both nations consider essential to democratic government. Pine Gap represents the systematic construction of a surveillance apparatus that functions outside the constitutional constraints that are supposed to limit governmental power. You cannot understand Pine Gap without first accepting that the facility has achieved something that should be impossible in democratic societies. It has created a space where the most powerful intelligence gathering systems in human history operate outside the oversight of the democratic institutions that are supposed to control them. The base functions as a joint sovereignty zone where normal accountability mechanisms have been suspended to accommodate surveillance activities that neither nation would authorize through normal democratic processes. The facility's location in the geographic center of Australia creates a psychological and political isolation that serves multiple functions. The remoteness makes democratic oversight practically impossible, while the harsh desert environment ensures that any unauthorized approach to the facility will be detected long before it poses any threat to operational security. The location has been chosen to maximize the physical and political distance between the surveillance operations and the democratic institutions that might attempt to control them. Consider the constitutional implications of a facility that operates on Australian soil but functions according to U.S. intelligence protocols while being staffed by personnel from both nations who are subject to security clearances that supersede their normal citizenship obligations. Pine Gap exists as a legal anomaly where the normal rules of citizenship, sovereignty, and constitutional authority have been suspended to accommodate surveillance activities that exist outside the legal frameworks of both nations. The facility's primary function appears to be the interception of electronic communications from across the Asia-Pacific region, creating a surveillance network that monitors the communications of friendly nations, allied governments, and civilian populations without the knowledge or consent of the democratic institutions that are supposed to represent these populations. The base operates as a listening post that treats democratic privacy rights as intelligence vulnerabilities, to be systematically eliminated. The agreements that govern Pine Gap's operations have been classified at levels that make democratic oversight impossible, creating a situation where the legislative bodies of both nations are prohibited from evaluating the constitutional legitimacy of the facility's activities. The base functions according to secret agreements that supersede the constitutional authorities that are supposed to control governmental power. But here lies the deeper horror. Pine Gap represents a successful experiment in the systematic construction of surveillance systems that operate outside democratic control while maintaining the fiction of democratic oversight. The facility has achieved something that should be impossible in democratic societies. It has created a space where the most invasive surveillance systems ever developed can operate without meaningful accountability to the populations being surveilled. The facility's joint operations structure creates a form of mutual governmental capture, where neither nation can terminate the base's operations without violating agreements that have been classified too highly for normal democratic evaluation. The base has achieved institutional immortality through the systematic construction of agreements that exist outside the reach of democratic modification. The personnel who work at Pine Gap are subject to security clearances that supersede their normal citizenship obligations, creating a population of government employees who are legally prohibited from providing democratic oversight of their own activities. The facility operates through the systematic construction of a workforce that cannot be held accountable by the democratic institutions they supposedly serve. Pine Gap's intelligence gathering capabilities represent something more disturbing than simple surveillance. They represent the systematic elimination of privacy as a democratic right through the deployment of technologies that make private communication impossible within the facility's operational range. The base has achieved the technological capability to monitor all electronic communications across vast geographic areas without the legal authority that democratic societies require for such surveillance. The facility's current expansion represents the systematic construction of surveillance capabilities that exceed the oversight capacities of democratic institutions, creating a situation where the technological capabilities of intelligence gathering have outpaced the constitutional mechanisms designed to control them. What keeps you awake at night about Pine Gap is not the fear of being personally surveilled. It is the realization that the facility represents a successful experiment in the systematic construction of surveillance systems that operate outside democratic control, proving that technological capabilities can be developed that exceed the capacity of democratic institutions to regulate them. Section 13. Woomera Prohibited Area. The Woomera Prohibited Area stretches across 122,000 square kilometers of South Australian desert as the largest land-based weapons testing range in the world, a space where the normal rules of civilian authority, environmental protection, and territorial sovereignty have been suspended to accommodate the systematic development of weapon systems designed to kill people who will never have the opportunity to vote on whether those weapons should exist. The area exists as a legal void, where the Australian government has transferred sovereign authority to military institutions that operate according to principles that violate the constitutional constraints that are supposed to limit governmental power. Woomera represents the systematic construction of a space where democratic oversight has been suspended to accommodate weapons development that exists outside the moral and legal frameworks that democratic societies use to evaluate the legitimacy of governmental violence. You cannot understand Woomera without first accepting that the Australian government has created a space larger than many European nations, where the normal rules of environmental protection, indigenous rights, and civilian authority simply do not apply. The area functions as a military sovereignty zone where weapons testing takes precedence over all other considerations, including the constitutional rights of citizens and the international obligations of the Australian state. The range's primary function is the testing of weapon systems that are designed to kill people in other countries, creating a space where the Australian government participates in the systematic development of technologies for international violence, while maintaining the fiction that Australia is a peaceful nation committed to diplomatic solutions to international conflict. Consider the environmental implications of a weapons testing range that covers an area larger than many American states, where decades of explosive testing, chemical weapons development, and radioactive material experimentation have created contamination that will persist for thousands of years. Woomera exists as a sacrifice zone where the Australian government has systematically destroyed a vast area of the continent to accommodate weapons development that serves the strategic interests of other nations. The area's impact on indigenous communities represents something more disturbing than simple environmental destruction. It represents the systematic elimination of indigenous territorial rights to accommodate weapons development that serves the interests of the same colonial system that originally dispossessed indigenous peoples of their land. The range has created a space where indigenous communities are prohibited from accessing traditional territories so that those territories can be used to develop weapons for killing people in other countries. The range's international cooperation agreements create a situation where foreign military forces conduct weapons testing on Australian soil without meaningful oversight by Australian democratic institutions. The area functions as a colonial military base where the Australian government has transferred sovereign authority to foreign military organizations that operate according to their own strategic interests rather than Australian democratic values. But here lies the deeper horror. Woomera represents a successful experiment in the systematic construction of spaces where democratic societies can participate in weapons development that violates their own stated moral and legal commitments. The range has achieved something that should be impossible in democratic societies. It has created a space where democratic governments can develop weapons for killing people while avoiding the democratic oversight that would normally be required for such activities. The range's security measures create a space where normal civilian authority has been suspended to accommodate weapons development that exists outside the normal legal frameworks that govern governmental violence. The area functions as a military jurisdiction where the constitutional constraints that are supposed to limit governmental power have been suspended to accommodate weapons testing that would be illegal under normal civilian authority. The range's current expansion represents the systematic construction of weapons development capabilities that exceed the oversight capacities of democratic institutions, creating a situation where the technological capabilities of weapons development have outpaced the constitutional mechanisms designed to control them. Woomera's isolation from major population centers ensures that the environmental and social costs of weapons development are imposed on communities that lack the political power to resist, while the benefits of weapon sales accrue to corporations and institutions that are insulated from the consequences of their activities. The range's legal status as a prohibited area creates a framework where the site of systematic weapons development has been transformed into a space that exists outside normal property law, environmental protection, and constitutional oversight. The area functions as a legal void where the normal rules of democratic governance have been suspended to accommodate military activities that serve strategic interests rather than democratic values. What terrifies you most about the Woomera prohibited area is not the fear of weapons testing. It is the realization that the range represents a successful model for the systematic construction of spaces where democratic societies can participate in weapons development that violates their own constitutional constraints, proving that democratic governments can create legal frameworks that allow them to operate outside their own moral and legal commitments. Section 14. Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay exists as a legal black hole where the United States government has achieved something that should be impossible in a constitutional democracy. It has created a space where people can be held indefinitely without trial, without charges, and without the constitutional protections that are supposed to define the relationship between governmental power and individual rights. This is not simply a military prison. This is a location where the normal rules of law, justice, and human rights have been suspended to accommodate forms of governmental violence that exist outside the legal frameworks that are supposed to constrain democratic government. The base operates according to a legal theory that violates the fundamental principles of constitutional law by claiming that the U.S. Constitution does not apply to people held on territory that is simultaneously under complete U.S. control and officially not part of the United States. Guantanamo represents the systematic construction of a legal paradox where constitutional protections can be eliminated through geographic technicalities that exist outside the moral and legal frameworks that democratic societies use to evaluate the legitimacy of governmental power. You cannot understand Guantanamo without first accepting that the U.S. government has created a space where the systematic torture, indefinite detention, and legal abandonment of human beings has been transformed into official policy through the manipulation of legal technicalities that exist outside the constitutional constraints that are supposed to limit governmental violence. The base's location on leased Cuban territory creates a legal framework where the U.S. government can exercise complete control over a territory while claiming that constitutional protections do not apply because the territory is not technically part of the United States. This represents something more disturbing than simple legal manipulation. It represents the systematic construction of a space where constitutional rights can be eliminated through geographic technicalities. Consider the psychological implications of a legal system that can suspend constitutional protections by moving people across arbitrary geographic boundaries. Guantanamo demonstrates that the constitutional rights you consider fundamental to democratic society are not actually fundamental. They are geographic accidents that can be eliminated by transporting people to locations where different legal rules apply. The base's detention operations represent something more disturbing than simple imprisonment. They represent the systematic construction of a legal framework where people can be held indefinitely without any of the legal protections that democratic societies consider essential to legitimate governmental authority. The detainees exist in a legal limbo where they are simultaneously subject to complete governmental control and excluded from the legal protections that are supposed to constrain that control. The base's interrogation techniques represent the systematic development of torture methods that exist outside the legal frameworks that are supposed to prohibit governmental violence against individuals. The techniques used at Guantanamo are not simply cruel. They are designed to destroy the psychological integrity of detainees while maintaining the fiction that constitutional protections against torture are being respected. But here lies the deeper horror. Guantanamo represents a successful experiment in the systematic construction of legal frameworks that allow democratic governments to operate outside their own constitutional constraints while maintaining the fiction of constitutional governance. The base has achieved something that should be impossible in democratic societies. It has created a space where constitutional rights can be suspended through legal technicalities that exist outside the moral frameworks that are supposed to define democratic government. The base's continued operation represents the systematic normalization of legal frameworks that violate the constitutional principles that are supposed to define democratic government. Guantanamo has achieved institutional permanence through the systematic construction of legal justifications that exist outside the constitutional constraints that are supposed to limit governmental power. The base's international legal status creates a framework where the U.S. government can violate international law while claiming that domestic constitutional protections do not apply, creating a legal void where human rights can be systematically eliminated through the manipulation of jurisdictional technicalities. Guantanamo's current status as a permanent detention facility represents the systematic construction of legal frameworks that allow indefinite detention without trial, creating a situation where the constitutional protections that are supposed to define democratic government have been suspended to accommodate forms of governmental violence that exist outside the legal frameworks that are supposed to constrain them. The base's legal framework creates a precedent where constitutional protections can be eliminated through geographic manipulation, establishing a legal principle that allows democratic governments to operate outside their own constitutional constraints by moving people to locations where different legal rules apply. What keeps you awake at night about Guantanamo Bay is not the fear of being personally detained. It is the realization that the base represents a successful experiment in the systematic construction of legal frameworks that allow democratic governments to operate outside their own constitutional constraints, proving that constitutional protections are not fundamental rights, but geographic accidents that can be eliminated through legal manipulation. Section 15. Diego Garcia. Diego Garcia exists as a testament to the systematic elimination of entire populations to accommodate military strategic interests, a space where the British and American governments achieved something that should be impossible in the modern world. They successfully erased an entire indigenous population from their homeland while maintaining the fiction that this elimination was conducted according to legal and moral principles that respect human rights and international law. The island serves as a joint British-American military base in the Indian Ocean, where the normal rules of indigenous rights, decolonization, and international law have been suspended to accommodate military operations that require the complete elimination of civilian populations. Diego Garcia represents the systematic construction of a space where military strategic interests take precedence over the fundamental human rights that are supposed to define the relationship between governmental power and vulnerable populations. You cannot understand Diego Garcia without first accepting that the British government successfully eliminated an entire indigenous population from their homeland through the systematic construction of legal frameworks that transform forced deportation into administrative relocation. The Chagosians were not simply displaced, they were systematically erased from their homeland through legal mechanisms that exist outside the international frameworks that are supposed to protect indigenous populations from governmental violence. The base's construction required the systematic elimination of the Chagosian population through a process that violated every principle of international law governing indigenous rights and decolonization. The British government achieved this elimination by creating legal frameworks that classified the Chagusians as temporary residents rather than indigenous peoples, transforming their removal from ethnic cleansing into administrative adjustment. Consider the psychological implications of a military base that can only exist through the systematic elimination of an entire indigenous population, where every military operation conducted from the base is made possible by the prior elimination of the people who had lived on the island for generations. Diego Garcia functions as a military facility that is literally built on the systematic violation of human rights, where military strategic interests are achieved through the prior elimination of human populations. The base's strategic importance to U.S. military operations in the Middle East and Asia creates a situation where the systematic violation of indigenous rights has been transformed into a strategic asset that serves the national interests of democratic societies that officially oppose the violation of human rights. The base represents the systematic construction of military capabilities that depend on the prior elimination of human populations. The base's current legal status creates a framework where the site of systematic ethnic cleansing has been transformed into a strategic military asset that serves the interests of democratic societies while being insulated from the legal accountability that those societies officially require for governmental actions. The base functions as a legal void where the normal rules of international law, indigenous rights, and governmental accountability have been suspended to accommodate military operations. But here lies the deeper horror. Diego Garcia represents a successful experiment in the systematic construction of legal frameworks that allow democratic governments to participate in ethnic cleansing while maintaining the fiction of respect for human rights and international law. The base has achieved something that should be impossible in democratic societies. It has created a space where the systematic elimination of indigenous populations can be transformed into legitimate military operations through legal manipulation. The base's continued operation represents the systematic normalization of legal frameworks that allow the elimination of indigenous populations to accommodate military strategic interests, creating a precedent where ethnic cleansing can be conducted through administrative procedures that exist outside the international legal frameworks that are supposed to protect vulnerable populations. The base's international legal status creates a framework where the British and American governments can maintain a military facility that exists through the systematic violation of international law, while claiming that their actions are consistent with their official commitments to human rights and indigenous rights. Diego Garcia's strategic importance to military operations in multiple regions creates a situation where the systematic violation of indigenous rights has been transformed into a permanent strategic asset that serves the interests of democratic societies that officially oppose such violations, demonstrating that democratic governments can maintain permanent military capabilities that depend on the systematic elimination of human populations. The base's legal framework creates a precedent where indigenous populations can be eliminated through administrative procedures that exist outside the international legal frameworks that are supposed to protect them, establishing a legal principle that allows democratic governments to participate in ethnic cleansing while maintaining the fiction of respect for human rights. What terrifies you most about Diego Garcia is not the fear of military operations. It is the realization that the base represents a successful model for the systematic elimination of indigenous populations disguised as administrative relocation, proving that democratic governments can participate in ethnic cleansing while maintaining the fiction of respect for human rights and international law. Section 16. Antarctic Treaty System. The Antarctic Treaty System exists as a legal framework that has achieved something unprecedented in human history. It has created a space where territorial sovereignty has been suspended indefinitely to accommodate scientific research and environmental protection, transforming an entire continent into a global commons that exists outside the normal rules of national ownership, resource extraction, and territorial control. The treaty represents something more disturbing than simple international cooperation. It represents the systematic construction of a legal framework where the normal rules of national sovereignty have been suspended to accommodate activities that exist outside the economic and political systems that govern the rest of the planet. Antarctica functions as a post-national space where different rules apply to territorial control, resource ownership, and governmental authority. You cannot understand the Antarctic Treaty System without first accepting that the world's major powers have created a legal framework that violates the fundamental principles of territorial sovereignty by prohibiting the enforcement of territorial claims while simultaneously preserving those claims for future assertion. The treaty creates a legal paradox where territorial sovereignty exists in suspended animation, waiting to be activated when the treaty system collapses or is terminated. The treaty's environmental protection provisions create a framework where an entire continent has been transformed into a scientific preserve that exists outside the normal economic systems that govern resource extraction and territorial development. Antarctica represents the systematic construction of a space where environmental protection takes precedence over the economic interests that normally determine how territorial resources are utilized. Consider the psychological implications of a legal system that can suspend territorial sovereignty across an entire continent while maintaining the fiction that territorial claims remain valid. The Antarctic Treaty System demonstrates that the territorial sovereignty you consider fundamental to the international system is not actually fundamental. It is a legal convention that can be suspended through international agreements that exist outside the normal frameworks of territorial control. The treaty's prohibition on military activities creates a space where an entire continent has been demilitarized through international agreement, demonstrating that military strategic interests can be suspended through legal frameworks that exist outside the normal competitive dynamics that govern territorial control between nations. The treaty's scientific research provisions create a framework where scientific institutions from multiple nations can operate on the same territory without the territorial conflicts that normally arise when different nations attempt to exercise authority over the same geographic space. Antarctica functions as a scientific commons where knowledge production takes precedence over territorial control. But here lies the deeper horror. The Antarctic Treaty System represents a successful experiment in the systematic construction of legal frameworks that suspend territorial sovereignty to accommodate activities that exist outside the normal economic and political systems that govern the rest of the planet. The treaty has achieved something that should be impossible in the international system. It has created a space where territorial sovereignty can be suspended indefinitely through legal mechanisms that exist outside the normal frameworks of territorial control. The treaty's resource extraction prohibitions create a framework where an entire continent's mineral and energy resources have been placed outside the normal economic systems that govern resource exploitation, creating a space where environmental protection takes precedence over the economic interests that normally determine how territorial resources are utilized. The treaty's current review process creates a situation where the legal frameworks that suspend territorial sovereignty can be modified or terminated through procedures that exist outside the normal democratic oversight that is supposed to govern international agreements that affect territorial control. Antarctica's legal status as a scientific preserve creates a precedent where territorial sovereignty can be suspended to accommodate activities that are defined as serving global rather than national interests, establishing a legal principle that allows international agreements to supersede the territorial rights that are supposed to define national sovereignty. The treaty's enforcement mechanisms create a framework where the suspension of territorial sovereignty is maintained through international cooperation rather than coercive enforcement, demonstrating that territorial control can be regulated through legal frameworks that exist outside the normal competitive dynamics that govern territorial conflicts between nations. What keeps you awake at night about the Antarctic Treaty System is not the fear of territorial disputes. It is the realization that the treaty represents a successful experiment in the systematic suspension of territorial sovereignty through legal frameworks that exist outside the normal systems of territorial control, proving that national sovereignty is not fundamental, but can be suspended through international agreements that serve interests other than national territorial control. Section 17. Yamantau Mountain. Mount Yamantau exists as a massive underground complex in the Ural Mountains, where the Russian government has achieved something that should be impossible in the modern world. They have constructed what appears to be the largest nuclear bunker ever built, while maintaining complete secrecy about its purpose, creating a space where the normal rules of international transparency, nuclear treaty compliance, and strategic arms limitation have been suspended to accommodate preparations for scenarios that exist outside the acknowledged frameworks of international nuclear policy. The complex represents something more disturbing than simple military secrecy. It represents the systematic construction of infrastructure that appears designed to enable the survival of Russian governmental institutions through nuclear conflicts that would eliminate the populations those institutions are supposed to serve. Mount Yamantau functions as a space where the normal relationship between governmental authority and popular sovereignty has been suspended to accommodate preparations for scenarios where democratic governance becomes impossible. You cannot understand Mount Yamantau without first accepting that the Russian government has invested billions of dollars in constructing underground facilities that appear designed to enable institutional survival through nuclear conflicts, creating a space where governmental continuity takes precedence over the survival of the populations that are supposed to provide democratic legitimacy for governmental authority. The complex's construction has continued for decades, despite the end of the Cold War, suggesting that the Russian government maintains strategic assumptions about nuclear conflict that exist outside the frameworks of international arms control and nuclear de-escalation that are supposed to govern nuclear policy in the post-Cold War era. Consider the psychological implications of a bunker system that appears designed to enable the survival of governmental institutions through nuclear conflicts that would eliminate the populations those institutions are supposed to represent. Mount Yamantau demonstrates that the Russian government maintains preparations for scenarios where democratic governance becomes impossible while governmental authority continues to exist. The complex's apparent size and sophistication suggest that the Russian government has allocated resources to bunker construction that exceed the resources allocated to civilian nuclear protection, creating a framework where governmental survival takes precedence over population survival in nuclear conflict scenarios. The complex's secrecy represents something more disturbing than simple military classification. It represents the systematic construction of strategic capabilities that exist outside the international frameworks that are supposed to govern nuclear policy and arms control. The bunker appears to violate the transparency requirements of international nuclear treaties, while maintaining the fiction of compliance with international nuclear agreements. But here lies the deeper horror. Mount Yamantau represents a successful experiment in the systematic construction of governmental survival infrastructure that assumes the elimination of the populations that are supposed to provide democratic legitimacy for governmental authority. The complex has achieved something that should be impossible in democratic societies. It has created a space where governmental institutions can prepare for their own survival through conflicts that would eliminate the populations they are supposed to serve. The complex's continued construction represents the systematic normalization of strategic planning that assumes the elimination of democratic governance while maintaining the fiction of democratic institutions. Mount Yamantau has achieved institutional permanence through the systematic construction of infrastructure that exists outside the democratic frameworks that are supposed to govern governmental authority. The complex's international legal status creates a framework where the Russian government can maintain strategic capabilities that appear to violate international nuclear treaties while claiming compliance with international nuclear agreements, creating a legal void where nuclear policy can be developed outside the international frameworks that are supposed to govern nuclear weapons. Mount Yamantau's strategic importance to Russian nuclear policy creates a situation where the systematic preparation for nuclear conflicts has been transformed into a permanent strategic asset that serves the interests of governmental institutions rather than the populations those institutions are supposed to represent. The complex's legal framework creates a precedent where governmental institutions can prepare for their own survival through conflicts that would eliminate the populations they are supposed to serve, establishing a legal principle that allows governmental authority to exist independently of the popular sovereignty that is supposed to provide democratic legitimacy. What terrifies you most about Mount Yamantau is not the fear of nuclear conflict. It is the realization that the complex represents a successful model for the systematic construction of governmental survival infrastructure that assumes the elimination of democratic governance, proving that governmental institutions can prepare for their own survival through scenarios that would eliminate the populations they are supposed to serve. Section 18. Dulce Base. Dulce Base exists as a location that may not exist at all, an underground facility in New Mexico that functions as a test of your willingness to accept uncertainty about the most fundamental questions of governmental authority and extraterrestrial contact. This is not simply a classified military installation. This is a space where the normal rules of evidence, rational inquiry, and democratic transparency dissolve into something far more disturbing than simple government secrecy. The base represents something more psychologically threatening than actual government cover-ups. It represents the systematic construction of uncertainty about whether your government maintains contact with non-human intelligence, whether your democratic institutions have been compromised by agreements with extraterrestrial entities, and whether the reality you inhabit is fundamentally different from the reality you have been taught to accept. You cannot understand dulce base without first accepting that the question of whether it exists is less important than the question of whether you can tolerate living in a world where such facilities might exist without your knowledge or consent. The base functions as a psychological weapon that tests your ability to maintain rational thinking in the face of systematic uncertainty about the most fundamental aspects of your reality. The base's alleged location, beneath the Archuleta Mesa, creates a framework where the normal rules of territorial sovereignty, democratic oversight, and scientific investigation have been suspended to accommodate activities that exist outside the acknowledged frameworks of human institutional authority. Dulce represents the systematic construction of a space where the normal relationship between governmental authority and popular sovereignty has been suspended to accommodate relationships with non-human intelligence. Consider the psychological implications of a facility that may conduct joint operations between human governmental institutions and extraterrestrial entities, where the normal rules of democratic accountability have been suspended to accommodate forms of cooperation that exist outside the constitutional frameworks that are supposed to govern governmental authority. The base's alleged multi-level structure creates a space where different levels of reality operate according to different rules, where human governmental authority decreases as you descend deeper into the facility, creating a hierarchy where extraterrestrial entities exercise increasing control over human governmental institutions. The base's alleged genetic experimentation represents something more disturbing than simple scientific research. It represents the systematic construction of hybrid populations that exist outside the normal categories of human citizenship, creating beings that challenge the fundamental assumptions about human identity and governmental authority that are supposed to define democratic institutions. But here lies the deeper horror. Dulce Base represents a successful experiment in the systematic construction of uncertainty about the most fundamental aspects of reality, where the question of whether the base exists becomes less important than the question of whether you can maintain rational thinking in the face of systematic doubt about your government's relationship with non-human intelligence. The base's alleged treaty agreements create a framework where human governmental institutions have transferred aspects of sovereignty to extraterrestrial entities in exchange for technological capabilities, creating a situation where democratic governance operates according to agreements that exist outside the constitutional frameworks that are supposed to govern governmental authority. The base's alleged security measures create a space where the normal rules of journalistic investigation, democratic oversight, and scientific inquiry have been suspended to accommodate activities that exist outside the acknowledged frameworks of human institutional authority, creating a void where accountability mechanisms simply do not function. Dulce Base's alleged existence creates a precedent where governmental institutions can maintain relationships with non-human entities outside the democratic frameworks that are supposed to govern governmental authority, establishing a possibility that democratic institutions operate according to agreements that exist outside the constitutional constraints that are supposed to limit governmental power. The base's alleged activities create a framework where the systematic construction of hybrid populations challenges the fundamental assumptions about human identity and citizenship that are supposed to define democratic institutions, creating beings that exist outside the normal categories of governmental authority and popular sovereignty. What keeps you awake at night about Dulce Base is not the fear of extraterrestrial contact. It is the realization that the base represents a successful experiment in the systematic construction of uncertainty about the most fundamental aspects of reality, proving that the question of whether your government maintains contact with non-human intelligence is less important than the question of whether you can tolerate living in a world where such contact might exist without your knowledge or consent. Section 19. Plum Island. Plum Island exists as a biological weapons research facility off the coast of Long Island, where the U.S. government has achieved something that should be impossible in a democratic society. They have created a space where the systematic development of biological weapons operates outside the international treaties, constitutional constraints, and moral frameworks that are supposed to govern the development of weapons of mass destruction. The island represents something more disturbing than simple weapons research. It represents the systematic construction of biological capabilities that exist outside the legal frameworks that are supposed to govern the development of weapons designed to kill civilian populations through the manipulation of disease, creating a space where the normal rules of international law, constitutional authority, and moral responsibility have been suspended to accommodate the development of weapons that violate the fundamental principles of civilized warfare. You cannot understand Plum Island without first accepting that the U.S. government has created a space where the systematic development of biological weapons operates under the fiction of agricultural research, transforming the development of weapons of mass destruction into scientific research that exists outside the international frameworks that are supposed to govern biological weapons development. The island's research into animal diseases creates a framework where the development of biological weapons can be disguised as agricultural protection, allowing the systematic construction of biological capabilities that violate international biological weapons treaties while maintaining the fiction of compliance with international law. Consider the psychological implications of a research facility that develops biological agents capable of destroying agricultural systems, creating weapons that can eliminate food production across entire regions while maintaining the fiction that such research serves agricultural protection rather than weapons development. The island's security measures create a space where the normal rules of scientific oversight, democratic accountability, and international monitoring have been suspended to accommodate biological research that exists outside the legal frameworks that are supposed to govern biological weapons development, creating a void where accountability mechanisms simply do not function. The island's alleged connection to the emergence of Lyme disease represents something more disturbing than simple research accidents. It represents the systematic construction of biological capabilities that can escape containment and affect civilian populations, creating weapons that operate outside the normal frameworks of military targeting and civilian protection. But here lies the deeper horror. Plum Island represents a successful experiment in the systematic construction of biological weapons capabilities that operate outside the international frameworks that are supposed to govern weapons of mass destruction. The island has achieved something that should be impossible in democratic societies. It has created a space where biological weapons development can operate under the fiction of agricultural research while violating the international treaties that are supposed to prohibit such development. The island's current transfer to the Department of Homeland Security creates a framework where biological weapons research that was developed under military authority is being transferred to civilian institutions that operate outside the international frameworks that are supposed to govern biological weapons development, creating a legal void where biological weapons capabilities can be maintained outside military oversight. The island's alleged research into bioterrorism represents the systematic construction of biological capabilities that can be deployed against civilian populations outside the normal frameworks of military targeting, creating weapons that operate through the manipulation of disease rather than conventional military force. Plum Island's legal status as a federal research facility creates a precedent where biological weapons development can be conducted under the fiction of agricultural research while violating the international treaties that are supposed to prohibit such development, establishing a legal principle that allows weapons of mass destruction to be developed outside the constitutional constraints that are supposed to govern their creation. The island's research protocols create a framework where the systematic development of biological agents that can affect human populations operates outside the medical ethics frameworks that are supposed to govern research that affects human health, creating a space where human populations can be treated as experimental subjects without their knowledge or consent. What terrifies you most about Plum Island is not the fear of biological weapons. It is the realization that the island represents a successful model for the systematic development of weapons of mass destruction, disguised as agricultural research, proving that democratic governments can develop biological weapons capabilities outside the international frameworks that are supposed to prohibit such development while maintaining the fiction of compliance with international law. Section 20. The pattern of exclusion. These 19 spaces represent something more disturbing than simple examples of governmental secrecy or institutional failure. They represent the systematic construction of an architecture of exclusion that has achieved something that should be impossible in democratic societies: the creation of spaces where the normal rules of constitutional authority, international law, and moral responsibility simply do not apply. Each location functions as a laboratory for the systematic suspension of the constraints that are supposed to limit governmental power, creating a network of spaces where democratic institutions can operate outside their own constitutional frameworks while maintaining the fiction of democratic governance. These are not anomalies or exceptions. They are the systematic construction of alternatives to democratic accountability that exist in parallel to the institutions that are supposed to provide democratic oversight. You cannot understand the true horror of these spaces without first accepting that they represent a successful experiment in the systematic construction of post-democratic governance, where the most powerful institutions in democratic societies have created frameworks for operating outside the constraints that are supposed to define democratic authority. The pattern that emerges across these locations reveals something more disturbing than simple governmental overreach. It reveals the systematic construction of a parallel governmental system that operates according to principles that violate the fundamental assumptions about accountability, transparency, and moral responsibility that are supposed to define democratic institutions. Consider the psychological implications of a governmental system that has achieved the capability to operate outside its own constitutional constraints while maintaining the fiction of constitutional governance. These spaces demonstrate that the democratic institutions you consider fundamental to legitimate governmental authority are not actually fundamental. They are performance mechanisms that can be suspended while the actual operations of governmental power continue according to different rules. The geographic distribution of these spaces creates a global network where the normal rules of territorial sovereignty, Constitutional authority and international law have been suspended to accommodate activities that exist outside the acknowledged frameworks of democratic governance. Each location serves as a node in a system where democratic governments can operate outside their own constitutional constraints while maintaining the fiction of democratic oversight. The legal frameworks that govern these spaces create precedents where constitutional protections can be suspended through geographic manipulation, jurisdictional technicalities, and classification systems that exist outside the normal frameworks of democratic accountability. These are not legal anomalies. They are the systematic construction of legal alternatives that allow democratic institutions to operate outside their own constitutional frameworks. But here lies the deepest horror. These spaces represent a successful experiment in the systematic construction of post-democratic governance that maintains the fiction of democratic institutions while operating according to principles that violate the fundamental assumptions about accountability and moral responsibility that are supposed to define democratic authority. The pattern of exclusion that governs these spaces reveals that democratic institutions have achieved the capability to systematically eliminate the constraints that are supposed to define democratic governance while maintaining the performance of democratic oversight. Each location serves as proof that democratic governments can operate outside their own constitutional frameworks while maintaining the fiction of constitutional compliance. The combined effect of these spaces creates a shadow governmental system where the most powerful institutions in democratic societies operate according to principles that exist outside the moral and legal frameworks that are supposed to govern democratic authority, creating a parallel system where accountability mechanisms simply do not function. These spaces demonstrate that the relationship between democratic performance and actual governmental operations has been systematically severed, creating a situation where democratic institutions can maintain the appearance of democratic governance while operating according to principles that violate the fundamental assumptions about accountability and moral responsibility that are supposed to define democratic authority. The architecture of exclusion that governs these spaces has achieved something that should be impossible in democratic societies. It has created a systematic framework for post-democratic governance that operates in parallel to democratic institutions while maintaining the fiction of democratic oversight. What keeps you awake at night about the architecture of exclusion is not the fear of any individual space. It is the realization that these spaces collectively represent a successful experiment in the systematic construction of post-democratic governance, proving that democratic institutions can operate outside their own constitutional frameworks while maintaining the fiction of democratic accountability, and that the constraints you consider fundamental to democratic governance are not actually fundamental but can be systematically suspended while the performance of democratic oversight continues?